The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Braxton's main administrative building as Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chun walked through the corridors with her usual measured pace. At 38, she carried herself with the quiet confidence that came from 15 years of military service. Though her slight frame and calm demeanor often led others to underestimate her capabilities. Sarah had learned long ago that in the military, respect wasn't always given freely, especially to women who had climbed the ranks through intelligence work rather than traditional combat roles. The weekly Joint Operations briefing was scheduled for 0800 hours in Conference Room Delta, the largest meeting space in the building. Sarah arrived precisely 10 minutes early, as was her custom, carrying a leather portfolio that contained classified intelligence reports from her recent assignment with the Defense Intelligence Agency. Few people on base knew the full scope of her work, and Sarah preferred it that way. Intelligence officers operated best when they remained somewhat invisible, gathering information and building relationships that others never saw. As she entered the conference room, Sarah noticed the usual cast of characters already assembling. Major Thompson from Logistics was reviewing his quarterly supply reports. Captain Rodriguez from Communications was testing the presentation equipment. Colonel Marcus Webb, the base's deputy commander, sat at the head of the long mahogany table, shuffling through a stack of personnel files with his characteristic air of self-importance. Colonel Webb was a man who wore his authority like an expensive suit, always perfectly pressed and constantly on display. At 52, he had spent most of his career in administrative roles, climbing the ranks through political maneuvering rather than field experience. His salt and pepper hair was always immaculately groomed, his uniform pressed to perfection, and his manner suggested that he believed everyone around him should be properly impressed by his presence. Sarah had worked with Webb on several occasions over the past 6 months since her transfer to Fort Braxton. Their interactions had always been professional, but cool. She sensed that Webb was the type of officer who felt threatened by competence he couldn't control, particularly when that competence came from someone he viewed as an outsider to his established hierarchy. The room began to fill with other officers as the briefing time approached. Lieutenant Colonel Johnson from the Engineering Corps nodded to Sarah as he took his seat. Major Patricia Wells from the Military Police Division offered a brief smile of recognition. These were career officers who had learned to navigate the complex social dynamics of military life, where rank, experience, and personal relationships all played roles in determining who spoke, who listened, and who ultimately made decisions. Sarah took her usual seat near the middle of the table, close enough to see the presentation screens clearly, but far enough from the head of the table to avoid drawing unnecessary attention. She opened her portfolio and reviewed her notes one final time. Today's briefing included updates on 3 ongoing operations, personnel reassignments, and budget allocations for the next quarter. Sarah's role was primarily observational, though she might be called upon to provide intelligence updates if questions arose about regional security matters. At exactly 0800 hours, Colonel Webb called the meeting to order. His voice carried the practiced authority of someone who had conducted hundreds of similar briefings, though Sarah noticed a certain edge to his tone that hadn't been present in previous meetings. Perhaps he was feeling pressure from higher command about some of the operational delays that had been plaguing the base recently. The first 30 minutes proceeded according to the standard agenda. Major Thompson presented his logistics report, highlighting supply chain improvements and cost savings measures. Captain Rodriguez updated the group on communications infrastructure upgrades. Lieutenant Colonel Johnson discussed the progress on facility improvements and new construction projects. Each presentation was met with appropriate questions and comments from the assembled officers. Sarah listened carefully to each report, noting details that might be relevant to her intelligence work. Military intelligence officers learned to find connections that others missed, to see patterns in seemingly unrelated information, and to understand how small operational changes might impact larger strategic objectives. It was detail-oriented work that required patience and analytical thinking, qualities that had served Sarah well throughout her career. As the briefing continued, Sarah noticed that Colonel Webb seemed increasingly restless. He drummed his fingers on the table during presentations, checked his watch frequently, and appeared to be only half listening to the reports being given. She had seen this behavior before in senior officers who were dealing with pressure from above or frustration with their current assignments. When Lieutenant Colonel Johnson finished his engineering report, Colonel Webb abruptly shifted in his chair and fixed his attention on Sarah. There was something in his expression that immediately put her on alert, a look she recognized from years of observing people who were about to make decisions they might later regret. "Lieutenant Colonel Chun," Webb said, his voice carrying across the room with deliberate formality. "I notice you've been rather quiet during these briefings lately, not contributing much to our discussions." Sarah felt the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere as other officers sensed that something was happening beyond the normal flow of the meeting. Conversations like this didn't usually occur in formal briefings, particularly not in front of junior officers who might later gossip about what they witnessed. "I've been observing and taking notes, sir," Sarah replied calmly. "My role in these briefings is primarily to gather information relevant to intelligence operations and to provide input when specifically requested." Webb leaned back in his chair, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Yes, intelligence operations. Tell me, Lieutenant Colonel, what exactly qualifies someone with your background to provide meaningful intelligence assessments for combat operations? Your file shows mostly desk work and liaison assignments." The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah could feel the eyes of every officer in the room focused on her, waiting to see how she would respond to what was clearly an attempt to diminish her credibility in front of her peers. This was the kind of moment that could define working relationships for months or years to come, depending on how it was handled. Sarah had faced similar challenges throughout her career, though rarely so blatantly or in such a public setting. She had learned that responding to disrespect with anger or defensiveness usually made the situation worse, while remaining calm and factual often revealed more about the person asking the questions than about herself. "My background includes 3 combat deployments, sir," Sarah said evenly. "Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. I've worked directly with special operations forces, conventional units, and local military partners. My intelligence assessments have been briefed to theater commanders and contributed to operational planning at the highest levels." Webb's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "That's quite impressive, Lieutenant Colonel. Though I have to wonder about the quality of those assessments when they come from someone who's never actually led troops in combat. Intelligence work is all very theoretical until you've had to make real decisions that affect real soldiers' lives." The insult was clear and deliberate. Webb was suggesting that Sarah's intelligence work was somehow less valuable because she hadn't commanded infantry units or armored divisions. It was a common prejudice in the military, where combat leadership was often viewed as the only experience that truly mattered, despite the critical importance of intelligence work to successful operations. Sarah felt a familiar calm settling over her, the same mental state she entered when conducting interrogations or analyzing complex intelligence problems. Emotion had no place in situations like this. Facts were what mattered, and Sarah had access to facts that Colonel Webb clearly didn't understand or appreciate. "Intelligence work requires different skills than command positions, sir," she replied. "Both are essential to successful military operations. My assessments are based on analysis of multiple intelligence sources, pattern recognition, and understanding of regional political and military dynamics. These skills complement rather than compete with tactical command experience." Webb stood up from his chair, using his height advantage to create a more intimidating presence. "That's a very diplomatic answer, Lieutenant Colonel. But diplomacy doesn't win battles. Leadership does. Decision-making under pressure does. Experience that comes from actually being responsible for soldiers' lives does." Sarah remained seated, maintaining eye contact with Webb while staying completely relaxed in her posture. She had learned from experienced interrogators that remaining calm in the face of aggression often revealed more about an opponent's weaknesses than any direct confrontation would. "I respect combat leadership experience, sir," she said. "I've worked closely with many outstanding combat commanders throughout my career. In my experience, The best commanders value intelligence input and understand how it contributes to mission success. It was a subtle counterattack, suggesting that Webb's dismissal of intelligence work might indicate a lack of understanding about how successful military operations actually functioned. Sarah could see from the expressions of other officers in the room that several of them recognized the implication. Webb's face darkened slightly. He had clearly expected Sarah to either back down or respond with anger, giving him justification for escalating his attack. Her calm, professional responses were forcing him to become more overtly aggressive, which was making his behavior look increasingly inappropriate to the other officers present. Understanding is one thing, Webb said, his voice rising slightly. But understanding without experience is just theory. And theory doesn't qualify someone to sit at the same table as officers who have actually led soldiers in combat and made life and death decisions under fire. The room had become completely silent. Even the usual background noise of air conditioning and distant conversations in the hallway seemed to fade away as everyone present realized they were witnessing something that went beyond professional disagreement. This was a personal attack designed to humiliate Sarah in front of her peers and establish Webb's dominance in the base's informal hierarchy. Sarah took a slow breath, considering her options. She could continue trying to de-escalate the situation, which might preserve the immediate peace, but would likely encourage Webb to continue similar behavior in the future. She could respond more aggressively, defending her qualifications and challenging Webb's right to question them, which might satisfy her personally, but could create lasting problems in their working relationship. Or she could reveal information that would completely change the dynamic of the conversation, though doing so carried its own risks and complications. The choice would determine not just how this confrontation ended, but how every officer in the room would view both her and Colonel Webb for the remainder of their time at Fort Braxton. Sarah realized that sometimes the most important battles were fought not on foreign battlefields, but in conference rooms where respect and credibility were won or lost through careful words and strategic decisions. As the silence stretched on, Sarah made her choice. Sarah looked directly at Colonel Webb, her expression remaining completely neutral despite the tension that had filled the conference room. She had faced hostile interrogations in foreign countries, dealt with uncooperative sources who held critical intelligence, and navigated complex political situations where the wrong word could endanger ongoing operations. This moment, while personally uncomfortable, was simply another professional challenge that required the same analytical approach she brought to all difficult situations. Colonel Webb, she said quietly, I understand your perspective about the value of combat command experience. It's absolutely essential to military effectiveness, and I have great respect for officers who have led troops under fire. Webb seemed pleased that Sarah was acknowledging his point, though there was still an edge of aggression in his posture that suggested he wasn't finished with his attack. Several other officers in the room shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, clearly recognizing that this confrontation had moved well beyond appropriate professional discourse. Major Wells from military police caught Sarah's eye briefly, her expression conveying both sympathy and concern. Lieutenant Colonel Johnson was staring down at his papers, obviously uncomfortable with the public nature of the conflict. Captain Rodriguez had stopped pretending to review his presentation materials and was watching the interaction with undisguised interest. Sarah continued in the same calm tone. My career path has been different from yours, sir. Instead of leading traditional combat units, I've specialized in intelligence collection and analysis in active combat zones. This work has required me to operate independently in hostile environments, build relationships with foreign military and intelligence services, and provide assessments that have influenced strategic decision-making at the theater level. Webb's expression suggested that he viewed this as more defensive explanation rather than a counter-argument to his challenge. That's all very impressive sounding, Lieutenant Colonel, but it still doesn't answer my fundamental question about whether someone with your background truly belongs at the decision-making table with officers who have commanded soldiers in actual combat situations. The insult was becoming more direct and personal. Webb was essentially arguing that Sarah's military service was less valuable than his own, despite the fact that intelligence work was crucial to every successful military operation. Sarah could see that other officers in the room were beginning to look uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Sarah had been in enough similar situations to recognize that Webb was escalating the confrontation because he felt he had the upper hand. In his mind, he was the senior officer with traditional combat experience, questioning a junior officer whose background seemed less substantial. What he didn't understand was that Sarah's calm responses weren't signs of weakness or uncertainty, but rather indicators of someone who held information that could completely change the dynamics of the situation. "Sir," Sarah said, "I think there may be some misunderstanding about the scope of my work and my current assignment status. My intelligence background has involved more than liaison and desk work." Webb waved dismissively. "Lieutenant Colonel, I've reviewed your personnel file. I'm familiar with your assignment history. While your service has been adequate, it doesn't provide the kind of experience that qualifies you to participate as an equal in strategic planning discussions with senior combat commanders." This was the moment Sarah had been waiting for. Webb had made his position clear. He believed her service record was insufficient, and her contributions to planning discussions were less valuable than those of officers with traditional combat commands. He had publicly questioned her qualifications and suggested she didn't belong at the same table as real military leaders. Sarah opened her leather portfolio and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a standard military communication form, the kind used for official orders and high-priority messages throughout the Department of Defense. She placed it on the table in front of her, though she didn't immediately reference it or explain its significance. "Colonel Webb," she said, "I appreciate your concerns about ensuring that only qualified officers participate in strategic planning. Military effectiveness depends on having the right people in the right positions, with the appropriate experience and authority to contribute meaningfully to important decisions." Webb nodded, apparently satisfied that Sarah was finally acknowledging his superiority in this area. "Exactly. Which is why it's important to maintain appropriate standards for who participates in high-level planning discussions." Sarah looked around the room, making brief eye contact with each of the other officers present. She wanted to ensure that everyone was paying attention to what would happen next, because the information she was about to reveal would fundamentally change how they understood not just this conversation, but the entire command structure they thought they knew. "I agree completely, sir," Sarah said. "Which is why I think you should know that my current assignment here at Fort Braxton is temporary. I'm actually on special assignment for my primary position." Webb's confidence began to waver slightly. Something in Sarah's tone suggested that this conversation was about to take a direction he hadn't anticipated. "Special assignment? Your orders show a standard transfer to intelligence liaison duties." Sarah smiled for the first time since the confrontation began, though it wasn't a warm or friendly expression. "Those are my cover orders, sir. They're designed to provide a plausible explanation for my presence here while I complete a special assessment project." The room had become so quiet that the air conditioning system seemed unusually loud. Other officers were beginning to realize that something significant was happening, though they weren't yet sure what it meant. Webb's voice carried a note of uncertainty for the first time. "Assessment project? I wasn't informed of any special assessment projects involving intelligence personnel." Sarah picked up the paper from the table and held it so that Webb could see the official letterhead and classification markings, though she kept it angled so he couldn't read the specific content. "The project involves evaluating command effectiveness and operational readiness at installations throughout the region. It's been ongoing for several months." Webb stared at the document, clearly trying to read enough of it to understand what Sarah was showing him. The classification markings were visible, as was the official Department of Defense letterhead, but the specific content remained hidden from his view. "My assessment work here," Sarah continued, "has involved observing command dynamics, communication effectiveness, and decision-making processes. All of my observations and recommendations will be included in a comprehensive report that goes directly to my supervisors." The implications were beginning to dawn on Webb. If Sarah was conducting an official assessment of command effectiveness, then everything that had happened in this room was potentially being documented and reported to higher authorities. His public attack on her qualifications might be interpreted as evidence of poor leadership judgment or inability to work effectively with intelligence personnel. "Who are your supervisors for this project?" Webb asked, though his tone suggested he was beginning to suspect the answer would be uncomfortable. Sarah held up the document so that more of the official markings were visible. The assessment project is sponsored by the Office of the Secretary of Defense and supervised by the Defense Intelligence Agency's Strategic Assessment Division. My direct reporting relationship for this assignment is through the Joint Chiefs of Staff Intelligence Directorate. The words Joint Chiefs of Staff seemed to echo in the silence that followed. Every officer in the room understood the significance of that phrase. The Joint Chiefs of Staff represented the highest level of military leadership, the principal advisory body to the President and Secretary of Defense on military matters. If Sarah was reporting directly to the Joint Chiefs Intelligence Directorate, then her authority and access to senior leadership far exceeded anything her visible rank would suggest. Webb's face had lost some of its color. He was beginning to understand that what he had intended as a public humiliation of a junior officer had instead become a situation where he had publicly attacked someone who reported directly to the highest levels of military command. "The Joint Chiefs?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded calmly. "My assessment of command effectiveness here at Fort Braxton will be briefed directly to the Joint Chiefs Intelligence Directorate next month. All of my observations about leadership dynamics, communication patterns, and decision-making processes will be included in that briefing." The implication was clear. Everything that had happened in this room, including Webb's attack on Sarah's qualifications and his suggestion that she didn't belong at the decision-making table, would potentially be reported to the highest levels of military leadership as part of an official assessment of command effectiveness. Major Wells was staring at Sarah with obvious surprise and newfound respect. Lieutenant Colonel Johnson had looked up from his papers and was watching Webb's reaction with fascination. Captain Rodriguez seemed to be trying to process the complete reversal in power dynamics that had just occurred. Webb sat down heavily in his chair, the weight of his mistake becoming clear. He had not only insulted a fellow officer, but had done so in front of witnesses while that officer was conducting an official assessment that would be reported to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. His behavior could now be characterized as interference with a special assignment, poor judgment in dealing with intelligence personnel, and failure to maintain appropriate professional standards during official meetings. Sarah carefully placed the document back in her portfolio, her movements deliberate and calm. "Colonel Webb, I hope this helps clarify any confusion about my qualifications and assignment status. I'm always happy to provide additional information when it might help improve understanding of roles and responsibilities." The response was perfectly professional, offering Webb an opportunity to gracefully acknowledge his error without explicitly forcing him to apologize or admit wrongdoing in front of the other officers. Sarah understood that completely humiliating Webb would serve no useful purpose and might create ongoing problems that could interfere with her assessment work. Webb struggled to formulate a response. He needed to acknowledge what Sarah had revealed without appearing weak or admitting that he had made a serious error in judgment. At the same time, he couldn't ignore the fact that everyone in the room now understood that Sarah held authority and access that far exceeded her apparent rank. "I was not aware of your special assignment status," he said finally. "If I had understood your reporting relationship, I would have approached this discussion differently." It was as close to an apology as Webb could manage without explicitly admitting fault, and Sarah recognized it as such. She nodded acknowledgement while maintaining the same calm, professional demeanor she had shown throughout the confrontation. The silence that followed was filled with tension as everyone in the room processed what had just occurred. The power dynamics of the meeting had been completely reversed. Webb, who had begun the confrontation as the dominant authority figure challenging a subordinate, was now in the position of someone who had publicly attacked an officer with direct access to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. But the reversal was about more than just rank or reporting relationships. It revealed something fundamental about military leadership and the difference between authority that comes from position and authority that comes from competence and trust. Sarah's calm response to Webb's attack had demonstrated the kind of professional composure and strategic thinking that earned respect at the highest levels of military command. As the silence continued, everyone in the room waited to see what would happen next. The silence in conference room delta stretched for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. Sarah could see the wheels turning in Webb's mind as he tried to process the complete reversal of what he had thought was a simple power dynamic. Around the table, other officers were experiencing their own moments of realization about what they had just witnessed. Major Thompson, who had been quietly reviewing his logistics reports, was now staring at Sarah with obvious curiosity. He had worked with intelligence officers before, but never one whose authority extended directly to the Joint Chiefs level. Captain Rodriguez looked as though he was replaying every interaction he'd had with Sarah over the past months, wondering what details he might have missed about her actual role and responsibilities. Sarah understood that this moment required careful handling. She had revealed information that changed everything about the meeting's dynamics, but she needed to manage the aftermath in a way that preserved working relationships and allowed everyone to move forward professionally. Completely destroying Webb's credibility would serve no useful purpose and might actually interfere with her assessment work. "Colonel Webb," she said quietly, "I understand that the nature of my assignment here hasn't been widely communicated. Special assessment projects often require a degree of operational security that can create confusion about roles and reporting relationships." It was a diplomatic way of giving Webb an excuse for his behavior, suggesting that the confrontation had resulted from a lack of information rather than poor judgment or professional jealousy. Sarah had learned throughout her career that allowing people to save face often produced better long-term results than forcing them to admit complete defeat. Webb seized on the opportunity gratefully. "Yes, operational security requirements can certainly create misunderstandings. I would have appreciated being informed about special assessment activities that might involve my personnel." Sarah nodded as though this was a reasonable request, though they both knew that informing Webb about her assessment work would have defeated the entire purpose of conducting an independent evaluation. "I'll make sure to coordinate more effectively with base command regarding information sharing protocols." Lieutenant Colonel Johnson cleared his throat softly. "Lieutenant Colonel Chun, if I may ask, does your assessment work involve specific areas of base operations, or is it more of a general evaluation of overall effectiveness?" It was a smart question that allowed Sarah to provide more context about her work while giving the other officers a better understanding of what they had been witnessing. Johnson was clearly trying to help everyone navigate the new reality that had emerged from Webb's confrontation. "The assessment covers multiple areas," Sarah replied. "Command and control effectiveness, intelligence integration, inter-unit cooperation, resource allocation, and personnel management. The goal is to identify best practices and areas for improvement that can be applied across similar installations." Major Wells leaned forward slightly. "How long have you been conducting this assessment?" 3 months, Sarah answered. "The timeline for this type of evaluation is typically 6 months, allowing for observation of multiple operational cycles and various types of activities." The implications were becoming clearer to everyone in the room. Sarah had been quietly observing and documenting everything that happened on base for 3 months. Every meeting, every decision, every interaction between officers had potentially been noted and would be included in a report that would reach the highest levels of military command. Webb was looking increasingly uncomfortable as he processed what this meant for his own behavior during that period. He was undoubtedly trying to remember every interaction he'd had with Sarah, every comment he'd made about her qualifications, every decision he'd made that might be viewed unfavorably by senior leadership. "Your assessment," Webb said carefully, "does it focus on individual performance or more on institutional processes and procedures?" It was a transparent attempt to understand whether his personal behavior would be highlighted in Sarah's report, but Sarah chose to address it as a legitimate question about assessment methodology. The focus is primarily on systems and processes, she said. Individual performance is evaluated within the context of how well institutional structures support effective leadership and decision-making. The goal is to understand what conditions enable military leaders to perform at their best. Again, she was offering Webb a way to frame the situation more favorably. His confrontational behavior could be viewed as a result of inadequate communication systems rather than personal failings, if he chose to learn from the experience and adjust his approach going forward. Captain Rodriguez spoke up. Lieutenant Colonel Chun, does your work here connect to similar assessments at other installations? Are you comparing Fort Braxton to other bases? Yes, Sarah replied. This is part of a broader study involving 12 installations across 3 geographic regions. The comparative analysis helps identify which practices are most effective under different operational conditions. Major Thompson looked thoughtful. That must give you a unique perspective on military effectiveness. Most of us only see our own installation's operations. Sarah nodded. It's been educational to observe different approaches to similar challenges. Military leadership is remarkably adaptable, but there are definitely patterns in what works well and what creates problems. She was deliberately steering the conversation toward the substantive aspects of her work, allowing the group to move past the immediate confrontation and begin thinking about the broader implications of what she was doing. This approach served multiple purposes. It demonstrated her professional competence, provided context that made her authority more understandable, and gave everyone a chance to engage with her as a colleague rather than focusing on the power dynamics that Webb had introduced. Webb was beginning to look more composed, though Sarah could see that he was still processing the full implications of what had happened. Lieutenant Colonel Chun, given your assessment role, I assume you have specific protocols for how you interact with base personnel and participate in normal activities. The protocols emphasize minimal interference with normal operations, Sarah said. The goal is to observe how things actually work, not to change them during the assessment period. Most of my data collection involves watching and listening rather than direct intervention. Lieutenant Colonel Johnson smiled slightly. So you've been watching all of us for 3 months without us knowing it. That must have been interesting. Sarah returned the smile, recognizing Johnson's attempt to lighten the atmosphere with some humor. Military officers are generally quite professional, even when they think nobody important is watching. It's been encouraging to observe the level of competence and dedication throughout the base. Major Wells laughed softly. Even when we're arguing about supply allocations and maintenance schedules? Especially then, Sarah replied. Those arguments usually reflect people caring deeply about doing their jobs well. Passionate disagreement about professional issues is often a sign of organizational health. The conversation was moving into more comfortable territory for everyone. Sarah's responses were demonstrating that her assessment work was focused on understanding and improving military effectiveness rather than finding fault or assigning blame. This helped the other officers see her as an ally rather than a threat. But Webb still seemed troubled by something. Lieutenant Colonel Chun, I have to ask about the timing of your revelation regarding your assignment. Was there a specific reason you chose this moment to clarify your role and reporting relationship? It was a fair question, and Sarah appreciated that Webb was asking it directly rather than letting it create ongoing tension. Colonel Webb, when you questioned my qualifications and suggested that my background didn't merit participation in strategic discussions, I felt it was important to provide context that might help you understand my assignment and capabilities. Webb nodded slowly. I see. And if I had not raised those questions, I would have continued with my normal observation protocols, Sarah said simply. My preference is to maintain the assessment framework without creating disruptions in normal operations. The exchange was revealing to everyone in the room. Sarah was indicating that she had revealed her special assignment status specifically in response to Webb's attack, and that she would have preferred to continue working quietly if he had not forced the issue. This suggested both restraint on her part and poor judgment on his. Captain Rodriguez looked curious. Lieutenant Colonel, does your assessment work ever require you to intervene in situations you're observing, or do you maintain a purely observational role? Generally observational, Sarah replied. Though if I observe something that could affect operational safety or mission success, I would obviously speak up. The assessment framework doesn't override basic military responsibilities. Major Thompson was thoughtful. It must be challenging to maintain objectivity when you're working closely with the people you're evaluating. It requires discipline, Sarah acknowledged. But military officers develop analytical skills throughout their careers. Intelligence work particularly emphasizes the ability to separate personal relationships from professional assessments. Webb shifted in his chair. Lieutenant Colonel Chun, going forward, how should we handle the fact that everyone now knows about your assessment role? Does that change how you conduct your work? It was a practical question that showed Webb was trying to move past the confrontation and focus on professional matters. Sarah appreciated the effort, even though she suspected his motivation was partly self-serving. Ideally, everyone would simply continue with normal operations, she said. The most valuable data comes from observing authentic behavior rather than performance that's modified because people know they're being evaluated. Lieutenant Colonel Johnson Schickard. That's going to be easier said than done. Now that we know you're watching, it's hard to imagine acting completely naturally. Sarah smiled. You might be surprised how quickly people return to normal patterns when they're focused on their actual work responsibilities. Military professionals are generally too busy doing their jobs to spend much energy on performance for observers. The conversation was helping everyone adjust to the new reality, but Sarah could see that Webb was still struggling with the implications of what had happened. His public challenge to her authority had backfired completely, revealing that she held far more power and access than anyone had realized. Moreover, his behavior had been observed and would likely be documented by someone who reported directly to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Sarah decided to address the situation more directly. Colonel Webb, I want to assure you that my assessment work focuses on understanding institutional effectiveness rather than evaluating individual officers for personnel actions. The goal is to identify systematic improvements that can benefit military operations across multiple installations. Webb looked relieved, though he was clearly still concerned about how his behavior might be characterized in her report. I appreciate that clarification, Lieutenant Colonel, and I want to apologize if my questions earlier seemed inappropriate. I should have sought to understand your assignment before making assumptions about your qualifications. It was a more complete apology than Sarah had expected, and she could see that the other officers were relieved that Webb had chosen to acknowledge his error directly rather than trying to minimize it or shift blame. No apology necessary, sir, Sarah replied graciously. Professional discussions about qualifications and responsibilities are always appropriate. Clear communication about roles and expectations benefits everyone. The response allowed Webb to frame his attack as a professional discussion rather than acknowledging it as the inappropriate confrontation it had actually been. Sarah was again demonstrating the kind of diplomatic skill that had made her valuable in intelligence work and effective in high-level military communications. As the meeting continued, Sarah could observe the subtle but significant changes in how the other officers interacted with both her and Colonel Webb. The revelation of her true assignment had shifted the entire dynamic of the room in ways that would have lasting implications for everyone present. Major Wells, who had previously maintained a polite but distant professional relationship with Sarah, was now asking more detailed questions about her assessment methodology and showing genuine interest in her observations about base operations. Lieutenant Colonel Chun, do you find that communication patterns vary significantly between different types of military installations? Sarah appreciated the question because it allowed her to discuss her work in substantive terms rather than continuing to focus on the confrontation with Webb. There are definitely patterns related to mission focus and organizational structure. Combat units tend to have more direct communication styles, while support organizations often develop more complex coordination protocols. Intelligence units usually fall somewhere in between, depending on their specific responsibilities. Lieutenant-Colonel Johnson nodded fully. That makes sense. Engineering units probably have their own communication patterns too, especially when we're coordinating complex projects with multiple stakeholders. The conversation was becoming more collaborative, with officers sharing their own observations about organizational effectiveness and asking Sarah for her perspective based on her broader experience. This was exactly the kind of professional dialogue that Sarah found most valuable for her assessment work, and it demonstrated that the officers at Fort Braxton were capable of engaging thoughtfully with strategic questions when given the opportunity. Captain Rodriguez raised an interesting point. Lieutenant Colonel Chun, does your assessment work identify best practices that could be implemented immediately, or are the recommendations more focused on long-term organizational changes? Both, Sarah replied. Some improvements can be implemented quickly with minimal resource requirements. Others require systemic changes that might take months or years to fully implement. The goal is to provide a range of options that commanders can prioritize based on their specific circumstances and available resources. Webb had been listening to the discussion with obvious interest, though Sarah could see that he was still processing the personal implications of what had occurred earlier. When there was a brief pause in the conversation, he spoke up with what seemed like a genuine question. Lieutenant Colonel Chun, based on your observations across multiple installations, what factors seem most important for maintaining effective command relationships between senior officers and specialized personnel like intelligence staff? It was a perceptive question that suggested Webb was beginning to understand some of the broader implications of their earlier confrontation. Sarah suspected he was asking about command relationships because he recognized that his own approach might need adjustment. Clear communication about roles and expectations is crucial, Sarah said. Many problems arise when officers make assumptions about each other's backgrounds, capabilities, or authority without taking time to understand the actual situation. Military organizations work best when people feel comfortable asking questions and seeking clarification rather than operating based on incomplete information. The response was diplomatic but pointed. Sarah was essentially telling Webb that his attack on her qualifications had resulted from exactly the kind of assumptions that created problems in military organizations. At the same time, she was offering him a framework for thinking about how to avoid similar mistakes in the future. Major Thompson looked thoughtful. That suggests the importance of better integration between different specialties. We all tend to work within our own areas of expertise, but we don't always understand how other specialties contribute to overall mission success. Sarah nodded. Cross-functional understanding is definitely important. Intelligence work is most effective when intelligence personnel understand operational requirements, and operations are most successful when commanders understand intelligence capabilities and limitations. The same principle applies to logistics, engineering, communications, and all other specialties. Lieutenant Colonel Johnson smiled. It sounds like you're advocating for more education about how different parts of the military actually work together. Education and regular interaction, Sarah agreed. Formal training helps, but informal relationship building is often just as important. When people know each other professionally and understand each other's expertise, they're more likely to collaborate effectively when challenging situations arise. The discussion was providing valuable insights for Sarah's assessment work, while also helping the other officers think more strategically about organizational effectiveness. This was exactly the kind of productive professional dialogue that characterized high-performing military units. Webb appeared to be gaining confidence as the conversation continued. Lieutenant Colonel Chun, do your assessments identify specific leadership behaviors that contribute to organizational effectiveness? Are there particular approaches that consistently produce better results? Sarah considered the question carefully. Effective military leaders tend to share certain characteristics. They ask good questions, they listen to input from people with relevant expertise, they make decisions based on accurate information rather than assumptions, and they maintain professional respect for all team members regardless of personal relationships or prejudices. Again, her response provided guidance, though that was clearly relevant to Webb's situation without explicitly criticizing his earlier behavior. Sarah was demonstrating the kind of leadership approach she had just described, providing useful information while maintaining professional respect for everyone involved in the conversation. Captain Rodriguez looked curious. Do you find that leadership effectiveness varies significantly based on the type of military background an officer has? Combat experience versus technical specialties versus administrative roles. Each background provides valuable perspectives, Sarah replied. The most effective leaders are usually those who recognize the value of different types of experience and know how to integrate diverse expertise into decision-making processes. Problems typically arise when leaders assume that their own background is the only one that matters, or when they discount the contributions of people with different specializations. Major Wells was taking notes as Sarah spoke. That suggests the importance of building diverse teams and creating environments where people feel comfortable contributing their expertise. Exactly, Sarah confirmed. Military effectiveness depends on utilizing all available capabilities, not just the ones that happen to match a commander's personal experience or preferences. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, covering topics ranging from personnel development to resource allocation to communication protocols. Sarah found herself genuinely enjoying the discussion, as it allowed her to engage with substantive professional questions while observing how the officers responded to strategic challenges. Throughout the discussion, she noticed that Webb was participating more thoughtfully than he had in previous meetings. His questions were more focused on understanding different perspectives rather than asserting his own authority, and he seemed genuinely interested in learning from the insights Sarah was sharing. Whether this change represented genuine growth or simply an attempt to demonstrate better judgment for assessment purposes remained to be seen, but the improvement was noticeable. As the formal meeting time came to an end, several officers lingered to continue conversations with Sarah about her work and observations. Major Wells expressed interest in learning more about assessment methodologies that could be applied to military police operations. Lieutenant Colonel Johnson asked about best practices for managing complex engineering projects in military environments. Captain Rodriguez inquired about communication protocols that had proven effective at other installations. Webb remained seated at the head of the table, clearly wanting to speak with Sarah privately, but uncertain about how to approach the conversation. Sarah recognized his dilemma and decided to address it directly. Colonel Webb, did you have additional questions about the assessment work or my reporting relationships? Webb glanced around to ensure that the other officers were engaged in their own conversations and couldn't overhear. Lieutenant Colonel Chun, I want to discuss what happened earlier. I realized that my approach was inappropriate, and I'm concerned about how it might affect both the assessment and our working relationship going forward. Sarah appreciated his directness. Sir, I understand that the situation created some confusion. Going forward, I think we can work together effectively if we maintain clear communication about expectations and responsibilities. Webb nodded, though he still looked troubled. Can you help me understand how my questions earlier might be characterized in your assessment report? I realize now that I made some incorrect assumptions, and I want to understand the potential implications. It was a fair question, and Sarah could see that Webb was genuinely concerned about how his behavior might be viewed by senior leadership. Colonel Webb, my assessment focuses on institutional effectiveness rather than individual performance evaluations. What's most important going forward is how the base command structure adapts to challenges and integrates different types of expertise into decision-making processes. Webb looked somewhat relieved, though he clearly understood that his behavior had been documented and would influence Sarah's overall assessment of command effectiveness at Fort Braxton. I appreciate that perspective, Lieutenant Colonel, and I want you to know that I value the expertise you bring to our operations here. Sarah nodded acknowledgement. Thank you, sir. I look forward to continuing to work together professionally. As the other officers began to leave the conference room, Sarah gathered her materials and reflected on what had occurred. The confrontation with Webb had been unpleasant but ultimately productive, as it had clarified her role and authority while demonstrating important principles about military leadership and professional relationships. More importantly, the incident had provided valuable data for her assessment. Webb's initial attack had revealed assumptions and biases that were likely shared by other officers at the installation. His subsequent adjustment, when confronted with new information, showed both the potential for growth and the importance of clear communication about roles and expectations. The reactions of the other officers had also been instructive. Major Wells, Lieutenant Colonel Johnson, and Captain Rodriguez had all demonstrated professionalism and adaptability when faced with unexpected information about Sarah's assignment. Their willingness to engage constructively with strategic questions suggested that Fort Braxton had solid leadership potential that could be developed through appropriate training and structural improvements. As Sarah walked back to her office, she began mentally organizing her observations from the morning into categories that would be useful for her final report. The incident had provided a perfect case study for examining how military organizations handled challenges to authority, integrated specialized expertise, and adapted to new information. But she also realized that the confrontation had changed her own situation at Fort Braxton in ways that would affect the remainder of her assessment work. Now that everyone knew about her special assignment, she would need to adjust her methodology to account for potential changes in behavior and organizational dynamics. The real test would be whether the improvements in communication and collaboration that had emerged from the morning's discussion would be sustained over time, or whether they represented temporary adjustments that would fade as the immediate impact of the confrontation diminished. Sarah suspected that the answer to that question would reveal important truths about the institutional culture at Fort Braxton and provide valuable insights for her final assessment of organizational effectiveness and leadership development potential. 3 weeks after the confrontation in Conference Room Delta, Sarah was completing her final assessment report when Major Wells knocked on her office door. The military police officer had requested a meeting to discuss organizational development opportunities, which Sarah interpreted as a diplomatic way of asking for advice about leadership challenges. Lieutenant Colonel Chun, thank you for making time, Wells said as she settled into the chair across from Sarah's desk. I've been thinking about our conversation after the briefing a few weeks ago, particularly your comments about cross-functional understanding and team integration. Sarah had been expecting follow-up conversations with several officers who had been present during the Webb incident. The confrontation had clearly prompted people to think more seriously about organizational effectiveness and their own leadership approaches. What specific aspects are you interested in discussing? Sarah asked. Wells pulled out a small notebook and flipped through several pages of handwritten notes. I've been observing communication patterns within my own unit and between military police and other base organizations. I'm seeing some of the same assumption-based problems you mentioned, where people make decisions about others' capabilities without actually understanding their backgrounds or expertise. It was exactly the kind of insight Sarah had hoped the incident would generate. Can you give me some specific examples? Last week, we had an issue with security protocols for a logistics operation, Wells explained. The logistics commander assumed that military police personnel didn't understand supply chain vulnerabilities, so he didn't include us in the planning discussions. When problems emerged during execution, we had to implement security measures reactively instead of building them into the original plan. Sarah nodded. How did you handle the situation? I requested a meeting with the logistics commander to discuss how we could better integrate security planning into future operations, Wells replied. Instead of criticizing his assumptions, I focused on explaining MP capabilities and asking questions about logistics requirements. We ended up developing a much better collaborative approach. Sarah was impressed. Wells had clearly learned from observing the Webb confrontation and had applied those lessons to improve her own leadership effectiveness. What was the result? Much better communication and coordination. The logistics commander actually thanked me for the initiative and suggested that we formalize the collaboration process for future operations. Wells smiled. It was a reminder that most professional problems can be solved through better communication rather than confrontation. This was exactly the kind of institutional learning that made assessment work worthwhile. Are you seeing similar opportunities in other areas? Wells consulted her notes again. Yes, and that's actually what I wanted to discuss with you. I think there are systemic opportunities to improve cross-functional collaboration throughout the base, but I'm not sure about the best approach for proposing changes to senior leadership. Sarah appreciated that Wells was thinking strategically about organizational improvement rather than just focusing on her own unit's performance. What kinds of changes are you considering? Regular cross-functional briefings where different specialties present their capabilities and requirements to each other. Joint training exercises that require different units to work together on complex problems. Maybe even rotation assignments that give officers exposure to other specialties. Wells looked thoughtful. The goal would be to break down the assumption barriers that create communication problems. These were sophisticated ideas that demonstrated real understanding of organizational development principles. Have you discussed these concepts with other officers? Informally, yes. Lieutenant Colonel Johnson is very interested in better integration between engineering and other specialties. Captain Rodriguez thinks improved cross-functional understanding could significantly enhance communications effectiveness. Even Colonel Webb has been asking questions about collaboration best practices. Sarah was particularly interested in Wells' mention of Webb. How has Colonel Webb been approaching these discussions? Wells hesitated slightly. He's been different since the briefing where you clarified your assignment status. More collaborative. More interested in asking questions rather than making assumptions. He actually requested a private meeting with me to discuss how he could better work with specialized personnel. This suggested that Webb's adjustment might represent genuine learning rather than temporary behavior change motivated by concern about Sarah's assessment. What was your impression of that meeting? Honestly, I was surprised by how thoughtful he was, Wells admitted. He acknowledged that he had made some mistakes in how he approached working relationships with officers from different backgrounds. He asked for specific feedback about his leadership approach and seemed genuinely interested in improving. Sarah made a mental note to include this information in her assessment report. Organizational learning often began with individual leaders recognizing their own areas for growth and seeking to develop new approaches. Major Wells, how do you think the base leadership would respond to formal proposals for enhanced cross-functional collaboration? Wells considered the question carefully. I think the timing might be good. There's been more discussion about organizational effectiveness since the incident in the briefing. People seem more aware that we might not be working together as effectively as we could be. Sarah smiled at Wells' diplomatic reference to the incident. It had clearly become a touchstone for thinking about communication and collaboration challenges throughout the base. If you were to develop formal proposals, what kind of support would you need? Data would be helpful, Wells replied. Examples of successful cross-functional programs at other installations, metrics for measuring improvement, cost-benefit analysis for different approaches. I'd also want to coordinate with other officers who are interested in similar changes to ensure we're presenting a unified vision. These were exactly the right considerations for developing effective organizational change proposals. Major Wells, I'd be happy to provide some information from my assessment work that might be useful for your proposals. I've observed successful collaboration models at several other installations that could be adapted for Fort Braxton. Wells looked pleased. That would be extremely helpful, Lieutenant Colonel. Do you think these kinds of changes would be viewed favorably by higher command? Based on my experience, senior leadership generally supports initiatives that enhance operational effectiveness, particularly when they're developed by officers who demonstrate clear understanding of both challenges and solutions. Sarah paused thoughtfully. The key is presenting proposals that address real problems with practical solutions, rather than theoretical improvements that might not translate into measurable benefits. Wells nodded enthusiastically. I'll work on developing specific proposals with measurable outcomes, and I'll coordinate with the other officers who have expressed interest in collaboration improvements. As Wells gathered her notes and prepared to leave, Sarah reflected on how the confrontation with Webb had generated exactly the kind of organizational learning that made her assessment work worthwhile. Instead of simply documenting problems, the incident had catalyzed discussions and initiatives that could lead to lasting improvements in base effectiveness. 2 days later, Sarah received a request for a meeting from Colonel Webb himself. When he arrived at her office, he carried a folder of documents and wore an expression that suggested serious professional conversation rather than social pleasantries. "Lieutenant Colonel Chun, thank you for agreeing to meet," Webb said as he took a seat. "I wanted to discuss several matters related to organizational effectiveness and my own leadership approach." Sarah had been expecting this conversation since her discussion with Major Wells. "Please go ahead, Colonel." Webb opened his folder and pulled out several sheets of paper covered with handwritten notes. "I've been doing some reflection and research since our discussion in the briefing a few weeks ago. I realized that I made some significant errors in judgment, and I want to understand how to avoid similar mistakes going forward." Sarah appreciated his directness. "What specific areas are you most concerned about?" "My approach to working with specialized personnel, particularly intelligence officers, and others whose expertise and authority might not be immediately obvious from their visible rank or assignment," Webb replied. "I've been reading about best practices for cross-functional leadership, and I realize that I've been operating on some assumptions that aren't supported by evidence." This was encouraging. "Can you give me some examples of what you've learned?" Webb consulted his notes. "Intelligence work, for instance. I had assumed that intelligence officers who weren't commanding combat units had somehow less valuable experience than traditional line officers. But my research shows that intelligence personnel often have broader strategic exposure and work more closely with senior leadership than most combat commanders." Sarah nodded. "Intelligence work does provide different types of experience and perspective. I've also been reading about assessment methodologies like the work you're conducting here," Webb continued. "I didn't understand how these evaluations contribute to military effectiveness or why they require specialized expertise and high-level access." Webb was demonstrating exactly the kind of learning that suggested genuine leadership development rather than temporary adjustment motivated by immediate consequences. "Colonel Webb, what changes are you considering in your own leadership approach?" Webb looked thoughtful. "Several things. First, I want to ask more questions and make fewer assumptions about people's backgrounds and capabilities. Second, I want to create more opportunities for different specialties to share their expertise and perspectives. Third, I want to focus more on understanding how different types of experience contribute to overall mission success." These were sophisticated insights that aligned well with best practices for military leadership. "How do you plan to implement these changes?" "I'm working with Major Wells and several other officers to develop proposals for enhanced cross-functional collaboration," Webb replied. "We're looking at briefing formats, training opportunities, and communication protocols that could improve integration between different specialties." Sarah was pleased to learn that Webb was actively collaborating with other officers on organizational improvement initiatives. This suggested that the learning from their confrontation was spreading throughout the base leadership structure. "I'd also like to request your professional advice about leadership development," Webb continued. "Based on your broader experience and assessment work, what specific areas should I focus on for improving my effectiveness as a senior officer?" It was a humble question that demonstrated significant growth from the officer who had publicly questioned Sarah's qualifications just 3 weeks earlier. "Colonel Webb, what do you think are your strongest leadership qualities?" Webb considered the question seriously. "I'm organized, detail-oriented, and committed to mission success. I work hard and hold high standards for performance. I have strong administrative and logistical capabilities." Sarah nodded. "Those are valuable qualities. What areas do you think need the most development?" "Communication with specialized personnel whose expertise is different from mine. Understanding how different types of military experience contribute to strategic objectives. Asking questions instead of making assumptions about capabilities and authority." Webb paused, and probably being more humble about the limitations of my own experience and perspective. These insights suggested genuine self-awareness and commitment to growth. "Colonel Webb, based on my observations, your administrative and organizational skills are definitely strengths that contribute to base effectiveness. The areas you've identified for development are exactly the ones that would enhance your overall leadership impact." Webb looked relieved and encouraged. "Do you have specific recommendations for how I could develop those areas?" Sarah thought carefully about how to provide useful guidance. Continued collaboration with officers from different specialties is probably the most effective approach. Ask questions about their work, seek to understand their challenges and requirements, look for opportunities to support their mission success. Over time, you'll develop better intuition for how different types of expertise contribute to overall effectiveness. "That makes sense," Webb replied. "I've already started having more regular conversations with intelligence, engineering, and communications personnel to understand their perspectives better." As their conversation continued, Sarah realized that the Webb incident had become a catalyst for exactly the kind of organizational learning that her assessment work was designed to promote. Instead of simply documenting leadership problems, the confrontation had generated discussions, self-reflection, and improvement initiatives that were likely to have lasting positive impacts on base effectiveness. When Sarah submitted her final assessment report 6 weeks later, she was able to document not just the challenges she had observed, but also the learning and growth that had emerged from addressing those challenges. Fort Braxton had demonstrated the kind of institutional adaptability that characterized high-performing military organizations. The Webb incident had become a case study in how military organizations could learn from mistakes, adapt to new information, and improve their effectiveness through better communication and collaboration. Most importantly, it had shown that confronting difficult issues directly and professionally often produced better long-term results than avoiding conflict or allowing problems to persist. Sarah's final report recommended Fort Braxton for recognition as a model installation for organizational learning and adaptive leadership development. The base had proven that military effectiveness could be enhanced not just through individual excellence, but through institutional commitment to continuous improvement and collaborative problem-solving. As Sarah prepared to leave Fort Braxton for her next assignment, she reflected on how a single moment of confrontation had revealed and ultimately strengthened the professional relationships that made military service both challenging and rewarding. The incident in Conference Room Delta had taught everyone involved important lessons about respect, communication, and the complex dynamics that shaped military effectiveness in the modern era.